Good evening. I'm Kari, Watkins, President and CEO of the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum. Thank you for joining us today for a special collaborative Better Conversation session about how do we tell the stories of events the world often forgets or ignores. Joining me in studio today is John Kennedy, our Chair of the Memorial Foundation Board of Trustees. We're also pleased to have two special guests with us today. Blayne, a high school junior who will bring a perspective from a generation born 10 years after the bombing, and Dr. Mike Edmonds, Memorial Board Trustee and Senior Vice President of Colorado College.
Our Better Conversations signature program has brought to light valuable conversations over these past 2 years, and it's important for our work to continue in this area. We thank the Kyle and Sarah Sweet family for sponsoring tonight's program, and thanks to Sarah for serving on the board of the memorial. We also thank those who are part of our virtual audience. Many are joining us by Zoom or on Facebook, and we look forward to your participation. Kari, I think it would be valuable if you'd tell the story of how Better Conversations evolved.
Great, thanks, John. In the aftermath of the bombing nearly 27 years ago, amidst the confusion, fear, and heartbreak, people clung to one emotion: hope. It was that same hope that gave family members, survivors, and first responders and community members the strength to come together in conversations in the coming months. People listened, and they talked and shared like never before. These countless hours of conversations ultimately led to the creation of the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum. And looking back over the past 27 years, we remember the value of bringing people together in conversation to gain different perspectives so that everyone is heard. 2 years ago this very week, we started this journey of changing the conversation when we rolled out Better Conversations with Oklahoma's own Krista Tippett and the On Being Project. We had planned to have better conversations in schools, places of worship, workplace, and even coffee shops. It was our gift to the community during the 25th anniversary year. And then, shortly after our inaugural luncheon, COVID shut down all in-person gatherings. So we pivoted to gathering online and in studio with compelling conversations on a variety of topics that reached thousands of communities and beyond. We arrive here tonight with an opportunity to engage in conversation with a generation not born at the time of the bombing. But before we dive into this conversation, we'd like to share and ask that everyone commit to the Better Conversations grounding virtues. Mike, I know you think these virtues would be helpful to use in the classes you teach and with your national speech and debate students, many who join us tonight. And Blayne, I encourage you to use these virtues in your leadership role as a junior class president, your involvement in Cleats for Kids and the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation Teen Board, and all the other activities in which you're involved. I firmly believe if we all practice these grounding virtues in every conversation, the outcome will be transformative. Mike, start us off.
Thank you, Kari. What I find most inspiring about the Better Conversation grounding virtue is that they are here for us to use every single day. They can be and should be practiced as we commit to better conversations with our families, with our friends, with our colleagues at work. The first grounding virtue is words matter. As we discuss today's topic and in your conversations with others moving forward, please use words that will shape how we will understand ourselves and each other. Be mindful of how you interpret the words and how you treat each other.
Better conversations can happen when we practice humility. Humility is about curiosity, surprise, and delight. Humility is not about being small. It's about encouraging others to be big.
Generous listening is the next grounding virtue. Listening is more than just being quiet while others have their say. It's about presence as much as listening. It's about making a connection more than just observing. To connect, however, we must listen.
Hospitality is the bridge to all these great virtues. You don't have to love or forgive or even feel compassion yet. That will take some time. Yet we can always offer our hospitality.
In our conversations, we must practice patience. Transformation takes time, always longer than what we'd like. A long, patient view of time will replenish our sense of our capacities and our hope for the future.
Adventurous civility is our final grounding virtue. In our world of constant change, it's about creating new possibilities for living forward, while being different and even continuing to hold profound disagreement.
Can we get a quick show of hands from our panel and those on our wall that we'd agreed to practice these grounding virtues? Okay, it's unanimous. Thank you all for committing to these virtues. Let's dive into our topic. How do we tell the stories of events the world often forgets or ignores? Now, Blayne, I'll be curious to hear from you first. At what age did you first remember learning about the bombing, and how was the story shared?
I first learned about the bombing when I was in 4th grade, and we had covered it in our Oklahoma history portion of that class. I remember just learning about how horrible it was and how crazy it was that something could happen in like my hometown. It was just a very hard truth to deal with, that the terrorism could be so close to home. I talked to like my mom about it and my family, and just kind of learned about their experiences and how it was just this event that just impacted the whole entire community.
Yeah. And then over the years, Blayne, are there examples of how you continued learning about the bombing as you progressed through your years in school?
Yeah, so like as I continued through school, we learned more about it like each year. It was kind of something that we made sure we addressed. I finally got to go to the memorial a couple years ago with some friends, and we really just spent that entire day learning about everything and just there was to know about the whole bombing. It was really a unique experience. It was very informational and kind of uncomfortable sometimes. It was hard to learn about it all, but I've learned kind of about the experiences that my teachers have had, that like other family members have had, and just how everybody has a reaction to that day and just how that has impacted them and their worldview.
Well, it's important we hear from you, representing your generation, about why it's important the story of the bombing be told to generations not even born at the time of the bombing.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important. We need to kind of learn that history, especially as Oklahomans, if you are from here. But what strikes me the most is how we responded. The Oklahoma standard was just set, and I've always kind of held to that just standard and hope that I can use that whenever I respond or whenever other tragedies strike.
It's a great perspective. Thank you, Blayne. Mike, share with us how you tell the story of the bombing in your classes at Colorado College. Obviously, these are students who are not local to our city or state, but yet you're teaching this in your classes and have been for many years.
Kari, I've taught the story of the bombing in my speech classes at CC for many years, and many of those students are with us tonight. I think it's really important when you work and teach at a liberal arts college to help students understand the importance of compassion, empathy, how to care, and why they should care. The story of the bombing reminds us that we're all one. It's community with the big C. Find it very important, and I want my students to know how to be able to deal with pain and how to take a painful situation and make something good out of it.
Yeah, it's no coincidence that the word unity is a part of community.
Correct.
What makes the story of the bombing relevant to generations living outside of Oklahoma?
James Baldwin said that we carry our history with us. The history is not necessarily in the past, it's in the present. And if we carry our history with us, we have to be willing to deal with those things that are uncomfortable, not pleasant, and equip people with the language, the understanding, the compassion to change. Is very important for us not to think of these things as something that happened in the past, but to realize that there are tragic things happening every day, and there will be other tragedies in our future.
Thank you. To both Blayne and Mike, if stories are forgotten or simply not told, are they less important? What makes an event important for us to tell? And let's start with you, Blayne.
I think everybody has a story to tell, especially with something as impactful as the bombing. Everybody has a personal experience from it. And so those are really important so that we can understand how events like this impact the community. I think we talked about that just now, how important community is, especially when we're responding to these horrific disasters.
Yeah, and all the lessons learned.
Yeah, that's great, Blayne. Mike, if a story is forgotten, is it less important? What makes an event important for us to tell?
John, I don't think we have the luxury to forget to tell stories. It's not only the stories that are forgotten, then the people are forgotten. And we actually want to be a better community. We want to do better. We have to be better. Therefore, we have to tell the stories of people that have been treated wrong in our community and our society. We have to talk about things that are uncomfortable to us. It's Black History Month. Whether or not we're talking about the struggles, the civil rights, or the story of the OKC bombing, in order for us to be better people, a better country, a better society, the option of not telling the story and or forgetting is not a real option.
Mike, stories like the bombing, Orlando nightclub shooting, Tulsa Race Massacre, Boston Marathon bombing, the terrorism across French, so many of these stories are still relevant. How do we keep those stories alive?
Kari, right now we especially have to keep them alive. We've gone through 2 to 3 years of COVID. These stories that talk about pain but also show us resilience, hope, future. They're a way to inspire not only the current generation, but generations going forward. We have an obligation to the people who were harmed by these events to be able to move forward and to really, we have to keep hope alive.
We encourage our online audience to send in questions about how do we tell the stories of events the world often forgets or ignores. And if anyone from the wall has comments or questions, please signal so we can bring you into the conversation. I know there's a lot of students on there tonight. I'm assuming you're giving them credit for this.
Oh,
Dr. Edmonds.
Absolutely. It's great to see them on the wall, and I appreciate their support tonight as I appreciate their support each and every day.
But they get more points if they ask a question.
They get more points
Okay.
if they
All
ask the question. And they've interacted with me, they know not to be shy.
Okay, they're prepared.
So far, Mike, you've brought more fans to Better Conversation than any guest we've had. How does the past inform our future, Mike?
Well, I'll quote someone else that I learn a lot from and read a lot of her work. Dr. Maya Angelou talks about how she respects the past, but she lived in the present, and she was thinking about the future. When I think about the OKC bombing, I know we have to look back, but we have to think forward. I keep going back to what do we want to be? And then how do we get there? And do we have the willingness and the endurance to get there, knowing that it's going to take all of us to get there, but we have to want something better than what we currently have.
Are some events forgotten or not talked about because they are just too uncomfortable? And if so, how do we equip and empower people to feel more comfortable? Let's start with you, Blayne. What makes you feel comfortable or empowered when talking about an event that's just tough to discuss?
I mean, I think when there's really tough things to talk about, I find it best to find a personal connection with whoever I'm talking to. And it's much easier to talk to a friend rather than a stranger. And so finding that common ground is incredibly important. And once you kind of share that personal experience, you are kind of invited to share in that pain and share in that passion and spreading that. So when we talk to someone that has really experienced something uncomfortable, you then can be passionate and share that message.
And in a safe space.
And in a safe space, of course.
Mike, you do tremendous work in the speech and debate community where controversial topics and stories are often explored and debated and discussed. What makes it comfortable for that to occur?
Well, many of my fellow speech teachers and speech and debate coaches are with me tonight, and I invite you all to join in, as well as I do my fellow board members from the National Speech and Debate Association. Kari, what speech and debate does, it removes the stigma of talking about things that are uncomfortable. It encourages discourse, dialogue, debate. We use the topics and the format to know that you can clash with ideals, you can exchange opinions, and in the process, you learn and grow. The same with interpretation, the same with literature. Literature represents one's lived experience. We know when a performance occurs, it's just not for entertainment. It's for growth. It's for being better. This is how speech and debate is able to look at things through a lens of equity with hope for the future.
Well, we have a question from the wall from Samuel Kinney. Sam?
This is Professor Edmonds. I was wondering how the perspective from which the forgotten story is told is relevant to how we view the historical event, and what your thoughts are on this.
What a great question, Sam. I go back to, we don't have the option not to tell the story of the Oklahoma bombing. And when we tell the story, Sam, thank you for your question, because when we tell the story, we just can't tell the story about the evil and the tragedy of it happening without telling the other part of the story, the resilience, the hope, the community, the bridge building, the future. When we tell the story, we also have to tell the story that in OKC, this damage came from within our community. This was one of ours. This was a veteran, but those actions, that violent action, impacted so many people across different racial, economic, social demographics. Everybody was hurt by the violence. So when we tell the story, we have to also stress the point that violence is not the answer.
Sam, that was an insightful question, and Mike, that was a beautiful answer. Locally, a story known in our Oklahoma City community, which is really only somewhat known, and it's not well documented nationally, is that of civil rights leader Clara Luper, who is not recognized for, but organized and participated in the first sit-ins in our country in 1958. This is an example of a story forgotten that will be told in our new Freedom Center and Clara Luper Civil Rights Center 64 years later. What are other avenues to help tell the stories that are not being told? Blayne?
I think for my generation, it's obviously social media. That's something that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. And so learning about stories like this, like Clara Luper, like the Oklahoma City bombing, is kind of our way of grounding ourselves and getting out of that internet kind of separate world so that we can really address the issues that are happening in our real lives and create some positive change.
Thank you.
John, I would just add to that, seeing so many of my former students and current students on the wall, to just realize we have to meet people where they are. We have to tell the stories through music, tell the stories through spoken word, tell the stories through poetry, help students be able to journal about what they're feeling. Talk about universal themes, love, hate, family, death, recovery, and help people be able to connect the story of the OKC bombing to their own life, to the life that they live every day.
I think you have a question for Blayne, don't you, Mike?
Blayne, I would really love to know, what do you think in our society should look like in 2030? What's your dream? What's your generation's dream for this country?
We as a generation are kind of given this huge question and this huge proposal, you guys are going to fix the world.
All of our mistakes.
All of the mistakes that have come from generations past. And that's hard to live up to. But I think the simplest step and simplest way to kind of fix that issue is to create more understanding and create a society that's empathetic and is open in their communication with one another, so that we're not this divided society that doesn't listen to other people. We only listen to our group. We are bridging those gaps and we're talking to each other so that something that someone's doing across the world can be done here. And those issues can be fixed on a global level instead of us just focusing introspectively.
Yeah. So Blayne, we talked about a year ago, Google was the #1 website in the world. Today, it's TikTok. And you're sitting with 3 non-experts on TikTok. So
I'm learning it.
yeah. How do we use technology, social media to help build the future? In addition to human capital, how do we use these tools to create and build and sustain community when physically we are not part of the same community?
I think you talked about social media and about TikTok and how just when there are stories that are really impactful, it's easy to get lost in just the constant information that's being thrown your way. I mean, I scroll through TikTok for an hour and there's just so much information that you can see. So really, it's difficult to understand what you should actually be learning about and you should focus your time on. But I think it's really important because once you do find those passions that you can talk about, you take it away from the social media world and you can talk about them with people in real life. And I mean, I mentioned how just global connectivity through social media is a great way to fix issues because we know what someone is doing when they're not in our community at all.
I have a question for you and Mike. Are you learning in school the art of compromise? I mean, has anyone discussed compromise and how sometimes you have to go meet in the middle for you to have a little bit of your way and for me to have a little bit of mine?
I think we address that in my school. I think it's something that we kind of set as an expectation, but we maybe don't work on explicitly. But I do think that it's a really important skill for us to have, especially in a world where information and getting what you want is so easy. So kind of understanding the art of compromise is something that we as a society, I guess, can work on a little bit more.
Yeah. I heard a student this week talk about what Abraham Lincoln had to give up to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. And I'm like, you mean compromise? And that was a whole new concept. So I was just wondering if that's something you feel like your college kids know, or is it something we've got to keep working on?
I think we absolutely have to keep working on it, but I guess, Kari, I would not necessarily talk about compromise. I want Colorado College students and I want the students I interact with and learn from and mentor to understand the importance of the common good. How do we get to the point where we share a common good and get beyond just ourselves?
How do we change the way we're teaching these events so the past is not repeated, Mike?
We have to be brave enough to talk about those things that we wish would stay hidden. We've got to be bold. We've got to be brave. We've got to realize we are not a just society. We have to talk about what a just society would be and the steps it would take to be a just society. And we have to get beyond the now and the instant satisfaction and understand and appreciate the common good. But you can only appreciate the common good if the common good involves all.
That's right. Inclusion. What about you, Blayne?
So like as I learn like in my high school and we kind of just go through history, I find myself kind of ignoring the awkward parts, and so I wish that like we could enter into a society where we take a moment when those things get awkward to really address them. It's really important. I mean, you mentioned kind of finding yourself in a community where it's easy to talk about those things, and for me, I find myself in different classes other than my normal history class talking about intense issues like this that have ties to history. And so having that multifaceted kind of view on these issues where you're always addressing them. It's not just when we're talking about it, we're addressing it. It's in our actions, we're addressing it. In like subconsciously, we're addressing it. It's everywhere in our day-to-day lives. We're addressing and we're taking steps to, like you said, moving towards the common good.
I just came from a conference where it was race directors from around the country that organized large marathons, and we talked about inclusion and bringing everyone to the table where everyone felt valued and had a seat at the table, and how we all have to do a better job of that. But the one thing I heard one lady saying is at least we're talking about it, which is more than we were doing 2 or 3 years ago. And when we quit talking about it, we've regressed. But let's look at the progress we've made and keep growing on that. Mike, give us some insight on that.
Conversation, speech, compassion. We have to do it. We have to share it. We have to teach it. But more importantly, we have to practice it, and we have to model it, and we have to be it. The option, I love this topic, and this topic came from a student who was participating in the National Speech and Debate Association. We just don't have the option to leave people behind or to think of people as disposable or not to talk about those things that are uncomfortable. It's our obligation, it's our responsibility to be better, to do better, and to talk better.
Well, we're coming to our online audience on the wall. Please raise your hand or signal if you have a question. Anybody want to start a question for us?
Mike, I'd like to make a comment about your reaction when Kari mentioned compromise. You took us to common good. And I think sometimes when we think of compromise, we're just thinking about meeting in the middle and not really listening to each other and not really considering everyone's interests. So finding that common good may really be more the future than compromise, because it involves listening to each other. It involves considering everybody's interests and then finding a point. Maybe that's when we compromise, when we've heard everyone, when we've listened to everyone, and we find that middle ground. And it looks like we have a question.
Jackson Turner from the wall. Jackson?
Hi, yeah, this is actually on that note. So on the subject of compromise, I was wondering, with all of the misinformation going around in the world right now, I was wondering whether you're actually supposed to listen and whether, like, you're talking to somebody that's misinformed, how you're supposed to still listen to them and then also educate them and have that the conversation make good points.
Great question. You want to tackle that, Blayne?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we, like, as Generation Z, X, whatever, we are always having this information coming at us, especially through online. And so I think understanding that what you're reading has bias to it and then doubling back and researching is really important. I don't quite know how to properly address someone when there's a disagreement. I think that's something that this generation lacks. I mean, we're lacking in that a little bit. So once we can kind of understand that process and finding places of understanding, we're gonna make a lot of change. Do you guys have anything?
Kari, I was just going to say that I see that Dr. Ed Lee from Emory University has joined us, and I'd love to get his thoughts about how do you confront misinformation, which I think that was Jackson's question. And Ed, it's always good to see you, and you're a leading expert in dialogue, discourse, and debate.
Well, I was showing up as more learner here, but I appreciate the opportunity to engage, and thank you, Dr. Edmonds, always. I'll start with sort of my question and maybe lean into a little bit where you were. And my question was really about how do we convene people across ideological differences. I find that conversations are happening, they tend to happen with people who agree with us. And we share our perspective and confirm that our truth is the truth.
Right.
And how do we create space where other people show up? And in some ways, I think that I'm curious about, for each of our presenters, what are strategies that they do in their communities to convene people who may have differences or engagement. The question that you asked me, Dr. Edmonds, I think that it really does center around figuring out how do we acknowledge that how people show up is imbued with a set of histories and experiences and ways of thinking about the world, and simultaneously honor those perspectives and honor them as opportunities for us to learn from them while inviting them to share. But also, as you listen to what they have to offer, you create space where they want to listen to your countervailing perspectives. And that happens first by us engaging in the act of listening and honoring the multitude of perspectives that can show up.
John, you want to talk about how you bring people together?
Well, I really enjoyed your question and what you said there, Ed. We gravitate to time with our friends who we may have a lot in common with, or we may have similar interests or similar backgrounds. But our opportunities for growth and learning are being around those who are different than us, who have a different perspective, a different point of view. And that's really how we break out of what Blayne was talking about, is we get outside our comfort zone and we have better conversations with others, with people who have different perspectives. And that's not always easy, and that takes a little bit of a leap of faith, not just really accepting what others say, but really accepting ourselves too. So it's a process for growth and learning, and it's something that I hope comes sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, you look at how Congress is set up or legislatures. I mean, it's meant to have both parties at the table. We've gotten a little partisan on the last few years, but if those, the president of Disney told me this morning that there's a caucus, a problem-solving caucus of Congress, and what incredible group these men and women are doing. But you don't hear about that in the nightly news. But if you could figure out how to surround yourself with people who don't all look like you or think like you, but are willing to come and have these tough discussions, think about the progress we could make. And I think that's something we encourage ourselves to do. Bring people to the table that don't act like us, believe like us, and for someone to throw us a curveball is good. I mean, it holds us accountable.
Sometimes I think Americans are allergic to conflict. I watch how our Congress operates, and they'll be fairly civil on the floor, and then they'll rush out to the lobby and talk to a news organization. But I was watching Boris Johnson addressing Parliament last week, and they're a lot more open in their conflict. They do it right there on the floor, and it's pretty raucous and it's interesting. But I do think some of our issues are that maybe we're afraid of conflict a little bit, afraid of just getting over that initial hurdle of disagreement. And if we'll get over that, if we'll get through that and start listening to each other, that's really more of the bridge to understanding each other and finding what you talked about, Mike, which is the common ground. Can't get to the common ground until you've experienced a little essential tension.
And on that note, I think for my generation, like, sometimes it's hard to address those uncomfortable questions, especially in an online sense, because you feel like everything that you say has a repercussion down the line. And that is a harsh reality for what we face. So like, if you say something controversial, there's a chance that follows you. But I think there's a fine line between just voicing your opinions and voicing them with others who you want to learn from, like you guys mentioned.
Bo Gold has a question. Bo?
Yeah, my question is for Mike. So Mike, you said in the beginning that words matter. But how do we teach the importance of words holding a tremendous amount of meaning to a younger generation who have, so many reasons to believe that words don't matter? If you look at the political environment today, you have these people who are supposed to be the pallbearers of, what it means to have a rational and respective, discourse, and they're kind of being everything but that. So how do we reframe, the idea that words are important, and how do we kind of convey that to a younger generation so that they can be good standard bearers as they go into the future?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I think we started tonight's conversation about talking about grounding virtues. And we actually did start with talking about words matter. We understand that words have a denotative meaning, and then we also understand words have an emotional meaning. We have to accept both. We have to start creating a sense of language and empowering people with language so that they can feel that they can be at the table and they are at the table. One of the things John talked about earlier was the importance of listening. And that is so important in any type of communication. Words do matter. Words matter, and we have to hold people accountable and responsible for the language we use and how they choose to employ that language. Whether or not people use words to divide, to belittle, or whether or not you use language to build up and to create. We have to understand that the process is fluid and that it involves accountability and responsibility, and talking is an action. And we have to be held accountable for our actions and what our actions may cause. But I'm a firm believer that more conversation, like better conversations, is better than less conversation. And Bo, Kari, I think you've met before. Bo is a Colorado College student who came and represented me here when I got the flu, and he actually had the OKC bombing story as an assignment when he was a student at Colorado College.
Mike,
Taught him well.
two of the things that we really look for in our best friends is to be listened to and to be understood. So if that's what we want out of our best friends, if we will just give that to a stranger, just give them that gift of listening to them as a pathway to understanding them, it changes the dynamics of individual relationships, but it also changes the dynamics of our society.
Yeah.
And I think you've also got to give grace, because if you're going to have these open, honest conversations, you've got to give people the space and the grace to mess up and say something that you can hopefully correct by teaching them something they don't know. Either they're not sensitive to it, or they're ignorant of it, or they simply don't know. I don't think it can go on forever, but I do think we've gotten to this, we just cut people off instead of bringing people along. Dennis Purefoy, one of our survivors, has a question.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. I wanted to follow up with one of the previous better conversations that the memorial had, which was before the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And unfortunately, at that period of time, there was a whole lot else going on in the world, COVID and a lot of politics still going on. So I don't think it got as much attention as it deserved. But that is one instance of looking back on our history and trying to be honest with it, dealing with the discomfort that comes with that. And later this year, there's going to be a movie coming out, Killers of the Flower Moon. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book, but it tells the story of the Osage Reign of Terror at the same time as the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so my question is, when that movie comes out, and it's true, how do you think we can build on that so people will understand the history of Native Americans in Oklahoma and across the country? What I'm afraid of is that people will just see the movie as a story with Robert De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio, and not realize that it's not only true, it's just the tip of the iceberg, and how we can move that conversation forward in Oklahoma. Thank you.
Yeah, we talked about earlier, Dennis, not on air, but when we were just sitting around talking, but how do we tell these lessons from the past that we personally didn't commit, but we want to make sure that our kids know them and the students know them. And sometimes it's by taking them to a place like the Memorial Museum or to the Tulsa Race Massacre, Greenwood Rising, and to go there. And I saw today one of my friends took her young kids there and said, my kids will learn this story. They won't have had to wait till they're an adult to learn that. I think that's part of it, but the other part of it is we do have to move forward in teaching these stories that are hard to tell. Mike, you're doing that.
Dennis, I appreciate the question. I actually was on the wall on that better conversation that you were talking about. I think we as country's history, that we have to take advantage of this moment and be willing to talk about all of our blights, but you can't stay there. You can't stay there. You've got to use that to be able to think about what the future could and should be for all of us. I think you're absolutely right. One of the worst things that can happen is for people not to realize that the Hollywood version was not the version of the people that lived through the tragedy. And how do we continue to move forward, but to do so with a sense of honesty and integrity?
Devin has a question.
Ed Lee has a follow-up.
Yep.
What can we learn from the OKC tragedy that you think we could use to build a more inclusive environment moving on? moving forward?
I'll start, Devin, then I'll Kari, John, Blayne. For me, when you think about the OKC bombing, violence was not the answer. And I just think that is something that when we think about what's happened in our country in the last couple of years, the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, violence is not the answer. We have to believe that collectively we possess the ability and the goodwill. And if we don't have the goodwill, get the goodwill to create an environment that is fair, just, and that all live. I just think that that's one thing that we have to learn from the OKC bombing, that violence is not the answer to a better government, to a better society. And that's not me saying we don't have to take a stand. We absolutely have to take a stand, but violence is not the answer.
Blayne?
Yeah, and like in response to that, it's violence is the like cause, but I've always taken so much from how we followed up from the bombing and how that Oklahoma standard was set and how our response just fostered this community that has continued on through the memorial like museum and through all of these things. And so when we personally have tragedy strike, I think we can find our community and find that group of people that can help us and can help us move forward positively.
Devin, that was a great question about relevance, and we really appreciate that question.
Scott has a question.
First of all, thanks for the invitation to be here this evening. So there was a lot of discussion about this allergy that people conflict, even non-violent conflict, and we tend to gravitate toward comfort even in tough conversation. In attempts to create inclusive spaces, how do you avoid flattening the focus of these tough conversations, especially when it comes to questions of equity and most especially race?
Well,
You want to take that?
Scott, good to see you, and I love the work that you are doing with the National Speech and Debate Association as the head of that organization, and I see some other board members on the wall. And I'll just use the work of NSDA as an example. You've got to be willing and brave to tackle it, even when it may not seem, even when it's not comfortable to do so, even when you come up against oppositions. I think the work that you have led, Pam, Katie Wyckoff, who's on the wall today, and what you all, and Dr. Lindsay in the Bay Area, you take these tough topics and you give people an opportunity to talk about them, to debate them, to perform them, but you don't step away. It takes organization and people who are willing to step in. I mean, it's, the playwright Idris Goodwin, in talking about Muhammad Ali when he was known as Cassius Clay, was talking about when Muhammad Ali decided he had to get into the civil rights fight. He said, I can't sit this one out. And that's such important wisdom for us to understand. Some of us are in positions of authority. All of us are in positions of influence. All of us are in positions of influence. We can't sit this one out. We have to be willing to step in. We have to be willing to go there. Kari is so right about grace because we know it's hard and tough to do, but we also know that people have done it for years.
Scott, what I loved about your question was, I'm sure you noticed, it was met with a moment of silence. And frequently in a conversation, the instant one person finishes talking, the other person has something to say, and it makes you wonder, did they really listen? Did they really consider what I just said? That was a very thoughtful question, and that was a question that everyone on the panel took a beat and thought about, took a second to think about. And so you can exercise leadership with a question, but also sometimes a little silence in a conversation is very helpful for understanding each other.
I think part of that is we look back 27 years and look at Timothy McVeigh, who was the perpetrator of the bombing, or the key instigator. We look at his military history, decorated American soldier. What happened from being a decorated American soldier to committing the worst act of domestic terrorism on American soil? Like, where was the disconnect on that? And so one of the things we've talked about, and it's a hard topic to discuss, but now we've had years of war. We've seen the march on the United States Capitol. We've seen violence in Seattle and Portland. We've seen all these acts of violence, and we really haven't gotten to the core of what has made people, what the disconnect is. Is it, many of these people are soldiers, many of them are veterans. Like, have we taken care of them as they've come out of war into this, from defending our country to being a peacemaker? I mean, those are issues we've got to be willing to look at, and we are. And we've got to figure out how to approach it in a way that's safe and yet comfortable, and that people are willing to come to the table and have those discussions. And that's a hard topic to talk about, but we know we have to do that. And that responsibility lies on us, and we feel it. Mr. Lee, I think you have a follow-up question.
I did have a follow-up question. I did have a comment about Cassie spoke to sort of the depictions of Native American existence and movies, and I think that one of the things that we need to make sure that we understand and appreciate is the role of representation. Yeah. That it is very difficult for Hollywood or media or someone else to tell a story of the existence and culture and perspective of another community. And so what we should try to do is create spaces for those people to show up and tell their own stories, because what we see in the world is through our own lens, through our own cultural frames, and those are always partial. And they're partial because we can't have a totality of existence. So whenever we speak to someone else's identity, that comes with its own form of violence and its own form of silencing a particular narrative, a particular perspective, and particular understanding. So we should be cautious about speaking to someone else's perspective, and instead creating space where those people can show up and speak their own notions of who they are. The final thing that I'll say here is your final point of sort of why the violence and why the move there. And I think that Martin Luther King sort of spoke to this, and it applies to both liberals and conservatives, that violence is the language of those who have been silenced. That if we don't create spaces for people, regardless of what their political perspectives are, to show up to the town square, the watering hole of the community, and find a place where they can be heard, we are going to have more January the 6th, because that becomes the way in which people find space and place to articulate their discontent and concern. We have to create communities that are willing to listen about and across our differences.
That's a great way to put that. And it goes in line with a comment we have online, where a gentleman talks about the inherent bias is different than the current deliberative disinformation some people and news sites create. You guys agree with that or disagree with that?
Oh, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I think we see a lot of bias, I mean, in social media, and it's hard to kind of differentiate where that bias begins and where it stops. It's our job as like to understand that there's bias in everything that we see and to just take that into account when we're spreading information and sharing stories.
Any other questions from the wall? One last chance as we wrap up this conversation tonight.
Ed, thank you for bringing us back to listening. I always think it's funny when we talk about a conversation, it's like, let's talk to each other. When we think of a conversation, it's people talking, or you go somewhere and you think, oh, what am I going to say? Instead of just show up and say, what am I going to hear? How am I going to understand that person? How am I going to connect with them? So thanks for, again, stressing the importance of listening in a conversation.
Absolutely. And allowing people their space. I mean, it's a great perspective, and that's something we started with and we should end with tonight is getting people their space to talk. Taylor Harris, you have a question?
Yes. When dealing with family members from your extended family whose perspectives you don't necessarily agree with, how should you approach having difficult conversations with them to help enlighten them without creating too much conflict?
Taylor, we're going to need to do a 4-hour show on that. You just asked the tough question right there.
That I have to say, Taylor, that is one of the reasons that we thought about this. Is I would come back and say, I have 80-year-old parents and teenage kids, and we're caught in the middle, and all are educated and smart people, but no one agrees on anything, and we have these nice dinners that turn into really bad discussions. And so it's a great question, and I don't think we've resolved it, but maybe Blayne, you can give us some insight from your perspective, and Mike.
I mean, as someone that kind of experiences those disconnects between family members, I think just taking a moment is always my best, route. Is just to take a moment to understand that they're coming from some place that's different where you're coming from, that you've learned different things, and those, like Mr. Lee had said, impact your perspective. And then, I always like to present the information that I've learned, ask them what they know, just so we can compare and contrast, and that way it turns into a conversation like we've been talking about, and it's not me speaking over you. It's something that is a discussion.
Blayne,
so Taylor, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Blayne, that's so well said. I would say, Taylor, I've taught conversation and speech for decades, but I actually love the concept of having virtues that ground the conversation, and having these virtues or that people can agree on give you the opportunity then to bring in universal themes and if you bring in universal themes that people can relate to, and you have a sense of things that people have agreed to, it makes the conversation richer. People may not walk away from the conversation feeling that you have persuaded, but what has occurred in having the conversation is very meaningful. So it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of time, but I do think the effort and the time pays off.
Taylor, how would you answer that question? That's such an insightful question, and nobody can hurt us like our own family members. I mean, that's where hurt kind of starts maybe sometimes, but how would you answer that question?
I guess my biggest thing, I was wondering, at what point is it worth starting conflict with family members that are older and have lived in their ways their entire life? So I guess that's kind of what stemmed my question is it even worth starting a conflict? And as someone, I'm a middle child who does not like conflict, so I was just curious about that.
Yeah, so maybe you're thinking, how can I do this without hurting someone's feelings? How can I do this without escalating this internal conflict in our family? Those are really good questions. And And it makes me think back to what Mike just said about maybe starting the conversation like we did today with grounding, virtues, talking about our values, talking about things, about how we all want to be treated, and especially how we want to be treated in our families. So maybe sometimes a majority of the conversation is about how we want to be treated and how we want to treat others, and knowing that no one can make us feel like this except our family in certain ways. So just being even more careful with our family members. But thanks for that question. That's a thought-provoking question. And I was kind of kidding about 4 hours, but we would need that much time to really think through that question.
I think embedded in your question is the question, is it worth the effort? And my response to you would be absolutely, regardless of the outcome, it's certainly worth the effort.
Thank you guys. And thank you for joining us tonight and taking part in these important conversations. Through teaching of our museum exhibits, our online educational programs, ongoing discussions like tonight, and on this sacred ground, we must continue to find common ground. You can find those grounding virtues at memorialmuseum.com. And if you haven't been to the Memorial Museum, we ask you to come and take a view and learn our story and understand that we'll be having these conversations throughout the year. If you've not signed up as a runner or a volunteer, registration's still open for the Memorial Marathon. You can sign up through our website at okcmarathon.com. We plan to have a better conversation amongst runners during race weekend. Watch for more details on that. We are so grateful to Blayne and John and Mike and our virtual audience. What an incredible perspective you guys all brought tonight, for joining us as we work to continue to find common ground on this sacred ground. Thank you again to Kyle and Sarah Sweet, and thank you all for joining us tonight.